So if we just continue along as we're going now, by 2100, we will have a world that's about 6 degrees warmer. And after growing to a peak of about 9 billion people, the carrying capacity of the world will fall, so that at the end of the century, we will have less than 1 billion. So that's almost 90% of humanity, or possibly more, dying out in the second half of this century in a world that's that much warmer. That's a higher death toll than the Jewish Holocaust. And the future won't look any better looking forward from 2100. That's the context. That's the misery that we want to avoid unleashing on our children when we're fighting this. So let's just pause and consider what that means, because nobody ever dies of climate change. People don't say, well, you know, that those people died of climate change. That's not how it happens. We don't know whether any climate event is directly related just to climate change. We know that it's a contributing factor. So what happens, what's going to happen is we're going to get flooding, and bodies will be washing up. We're going to get land loss as land just literally goes off into the sea, goes under the waves. We're going to get areas that used to be agriculturally productive getting salinated with the ocean water coming in underneath and having to be abandoned. We're going to get droughts in other parts of the world and people just not being able to survive. Agricultural communities that have thrived for many, many millennia that will have to be abandoned. We'll have refugees, this throbbing hum of desperate humanity moving, on the move. There's expected to be anywhere between 50 million and 1 billion refugees by mid-century. People will be shot at borders trying to enter safe countries. I don't want to live in a world where my children have to decide who to turn away. We're going to get resource wars. Oh God, this just makes me cry just to think about it. We'll get diseases, and ironically, some of these diseases aren't even that serious. But when you have huddled masses of desperate humans in compromised health situations and social services that are stressed to the brink, we won't be able to handle them, and they'll spread everywhere. Already, there are over 315,000 deaths from climate change each year, and it's growing. So I just want to pause to consider, when you have more than 315,000 people dying each year, how much time? I'm going to go ahead. Okay, sorry. Go back.
Adriana, push your mic down a little bit. Push your mic down so it doesn't block you.
Sorry.
Thank you. If it goes down. Otherwise, don't worry about it.
The Copenhagen talks collapsed in 2009. The last-minute accord was cobbled together without broad consensus. There was a lot of problems with it. Developing countries particularly were horrified by it. The targets were aspirational, not non-binding, and weak. There was no common benchmark year to base reductions on, no specific short or midterm global goal beyond the lofty stated ideals. But there were 3 good things that came out of Copenhagen. One was the recognition that at least some developing countries would actually have to participate. Now that, I don't want to make it sound like, you know, I really think China should do as much as we do. That would be ridiculous. Their per capita emissions are much lower than ours. And I also don't think that Canada is in any position to make any demands because we failed so miserably in terms of our emissions. But at the same time, you have Europeans meeting, usually by and large meeting their Kyoto targets, and a lot of that, studies have shown, has happened because they've literally offshored a lot of their emissions into China, where things are manufactured with even greater emissions. So it is a global problem, and we do have to recognize it, and we can't just switch to yet another country that is going to make things worse. So we do have to curb the insane growth, and that means that China doesn't get to grow at whatever emissions growth rate they choose. The second was the recognition that 2 degrees or 450 parts per million is the absolute upper limit of what we can tolerate. That doesn't sound like a very ambitious target to people who understand the crisis, but developed countries, it had never been stated in that way. Basically, all the countries had committed to up until that point was that they would prevent catastrophic climate change, and it was left up to the imagination to determine what that was. So having that target was actually an important thing. There was also a recognition that 350 parts per million was a possible goal, and the reasoning behind this was that the AOSIS nations, the Alliance of Small Island States, had commissioned a study to find out what it would take to keep their countries from going beneath the waves. And that's what the answer was, 350. So we emerged from Copenhagen with at least a recognition that we had to limit our emissions to 450 as the absolute upper limit, and possibly 350. Now keep in mind, our parts per million at that time were already 390. So, and getting emissions out of the atmosphere is a great deal more difficult than not emitting them in the first place. At this point, the United Nations Environment Program stepped in, and they were concerned about the disjoint between the long-term agreements and the particular commitments that countries had made. And they got to work on a study that they released in November 2010 called the Emissions Gap Report. And it was intended to guide negotiations in Cancun. Now, this was important because the United Nations negotiations do not generally consider reports done by scientists or individuals or countries because they can be biased, and they don't want to pick, well, we're going to choose that document or that document, which is part of the problem, is that we're still looking at documents that are very, very dated when we're looking at the IPCC report. So it was actually critical that the United Nations Environment Program stepped in and was this international organization. So it did get some traction at the Cancun Agreement. And it's really a report on the credibility gap between what nations were promising to do in the long run and what they were committing to doing in the next decade. And the report studied a variety of plausible trajectories. So here's the trajectory that is envisioned if we do nothing, and that's business as usual. So the emissions would be expected to rise to 56 gigatons by 2020, an increase of 150%. I actually should point out, these are not accurate at all. They're kind of symbolic. So an increase of about 150% on 1990 levels, and about 75% higher than current levels. And here's the trajectory that we can expect if countries keep their promises about meeting their Copenhagen targets. There's, again, for all of these things, there's a range, and I've kind of picked somewhere sort of in between. So this is 53 gigatons instead of 56 gigatons if we do nothing. And it's an increase of 135% on 1990 levels and about 65% higher than current levels. Note that Copenhagen is not binding. So there's nothing to ensure that even those emissions targets will ever be met. And the UNEP report pointed out that if those countries use offsets, it's quite possible that it could be even worse. So basically, we're almost committing to doing nothing. The emissions gap then focused on the trajectories in the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that would have a good or a very good likelihood of staying below 450 parts per million. So here's a mid-range trajectory for what that would take. And you can see the huge gap here going up to 2020 between what countries are saying they're going to do and what they really need to be doing in order to actually get to where they say they need to go. Again, the point here with all of these charts, what you need to measure is the total carbon emitted, which is the area underneath the graph. So if we do that, sorry, that's wrong. If we do that, then this whole area under the graph is all emissions. It's a huge amount of emissions. This chart, we could go higher a little here, but it means that we'd have to go lower here in order to make up for it, because the total emissions have to be equivalent to what's in this to meet the 450 target, thereabouts. It's a very challenging target. all the plausible trajectories to reach 450 parts per million, all of them that they studied, require a peaking of global emissions before 2020, which means that emissions in developed countries really should peak well before. Really, they should be going down now if we're to have any hope of reaching this target. The emissions gap report made a number of recommendations to try to bridge that gap and strengthen the levels of ambition so that we could do that, and to make sure that countries were held accountable if they failed. Now, the report also wanted to look at trajectories for 350 parts per million, because that was another target that was agreed to in Copenhagen as a possible target that countries would consider. Now, there's a problem with that, because when they looked in the IPCC report, the 2007 report had no plausible trajectories that would reach 350 parts per million. When governments first started looking at this science, they were looking at possibly a doubling of CO2 to 550 parts per million, possibly higher, as plausible trajectories. Nobody thought that 350 would be necessary. So they had to actually manufacture a few trajectories that might be plausible. And all of them looked sort of like this. Now, the AOSIS nations, the Alliance of Small Island States, are really looking at this very seriously with great hope, because this is the only thing that they see as a plausible way of keeping their countries above the waves, above the water. But there's something really important to note here, which is this part. Do you notice that it goes below zero? Well, how do you get below zero? How do you get emissions below zero? Well, you do that by burning purpose-grown forest and sequestering the carbon. You do that with things like biochar. You do that with things like fertilizing the oceans to absorb more carbon. It's a commitment to geoengineering. And of course, that opens up all kinds of rights issues. We have terrible unknown impacts of new technologies and concerns about the rights of indigenous peoples who would be profoundly affected by these kinds of things. So what we're doing is we're pitting the rights of indigenous communities against the rights of inhabitants of low-lying island states when we choose between 350 and 450. There is still a way to respect the climate rights of both groups. And it's a scenario that was presented by 350.org, and it looks like this. What they've suggested is that if you want to do this, the amount of carbon that you are allowed, your carbon budget, is so limited that we would have to eliminate globally 97% of our carbon in this decade. So what would that look like? And I want to point out, this is another kind of hell too. For Canada, I mean, think about it. Think about eliminating 100% of everything that you ever burn. No more cars that run on gasoline. No more burning anything in your house, any fossil fuels in your house. Sorry?
Goodbye tar sands?
Oh, of course. But I mean, that would be the first thing to go, and it would be welcome. But there are all kinds of things that we take for granted that would not be so welcome. They would be very, very difficult. It would mean probably a profound reduction in our quality of life in order to achieve that. But that's in this country. The thing is that this would actually probably be opposed by most people in developing countries too, in part because, for very, very good reasons, because people's ability to respond to climate change is actually very, very well correlated with wealth too. People who live in poverty cannot handle the kinds of changes that climate change throws at them either. So, you know, telling them you don't have any development rights anymore because we've just lost our space, we've blown it, is not something that they're going to welcome either. So this is actually, you know, the orange scenario is probably what I would argue for, and I'll tell you why in a sec. But it is a different kind of hell, and there's not that many people who would support it. In this room, probably Sean Conn and Glenn McIntosh, I think. And you? Welcome. We'll work together. And I'm happy to lobby it, but I mean, to make that kind of thing happen, we'd have to have a global army demanding it, and I just don't see that as likely. But the important thing well, actually, I'm going to talk to you about why I would choose that. The reason why I would choose that is that there's another issue going on, which is the ocean acidification issue, which Glenn touched on. Carbon dioxide in oceans forms carbonic acid, and this is something that we're just starting to really learn about. We don't know what the impacts are, but they're potentially even more serious. And whereas we can geoengineer our way out of some of the impacts of terrestrial climate change, there is nothing that we can do once we alter the chemistry of the oceans. So if we throw ourselves into a situation where the ocean starts spewing out hydrogen sulfide and it goes in huge belching waves over the lands, it will destroy everything in its path, plants and animals and anything that relies on oxygen to breathe. So, I mean, we're playing with really, really loaded dice here, and that's why I would choose that scenario. But, you know, our options here have become very, very, very nasty. So we've waited so long that we have to make some very nasty decisions. We're pitting development rights, ocean health, indigenous rights, our lifestyle, the ability of low-lying and island nations just to survive. And recent reports have vacillated between saying we absolutely need to commit to 350 parts per million because that's the only safe way. Some reports even say we need to keep it lower than 350 parts per million. While other reports say, well, we've just made it impossible to reach even 450 parts per million. We're in a very, very, very touchy situation. So, I mean, whatever we do, we better do it fast. We better commit to very, very rapid emissions reductions as quickly as possible, as quickly as we can possibly imagine cutting those things. I was going to talk about, I guess I can talk about Canada a little bit. Our government's possibly the worst global player of all. The Harper government inherited a bad situation and made it worse. So when Prime Minister Harper was elected in 2006, emissions had risen by 24% above 1990 levels. And you can see that. That was about the time that Harper was elected. It had come down just a little bit. But that was 1990. That's where the Kyoto target is. So we should have been going down from there that way. Instead, we went up. When Prime Minister Harper was elected, he said, what? How am I going to get down there? So admittedly, the situation became very difficult, but he eviscerated the few programs that we had that were reducing emissions. He became the only Kyoto signatory nation which refused to meet its targets and opposed the continuation of the Kyoto Protocol. He insisted that China and other emerging economies have to make substantial cuts while refusing to do so ourselves. He argues that even though Canada agreed that developing countries should reduce emissions by over developed countries should reduce emissions by over 25% below 1990 levels, Canada's exceptional, and we need weaker targets. So just how much weaker? Well, that's it. This is actually the proposal that the government just presented to the United Nations. That's where he wants to be.
What's the difference between red and blue?
The red is business as usual. This is where the government says that we're going to be based on what they're doing. And they've said that we've reduced 25 to 40 megatons of emissions reductions even now. Though I should point out that it clashes with an Environment Canada report that federal actions have reduced emissions by 4 megatons, not 40, 4. And this is what the Harper government calls ambitious. And I'm happy to call it the Harper government for this because it sure doesn't represent me. The Canadian target, if you note, it's above 600, whereas 1990 was below 600. So not only are we not meeting Kyoto, 10 years too late, not only are we not meeting, not even lowering our emissions, we're actually raising our emissions above the 1990 baseline, which is the international standard. Tar sands are an important factor. I'll show you this chart. Sorry, this is what I would consider a more reasonable target. This would reflect Canada's failure to meet Kyoto. We would have to bring it lower, plus leaving options open to reach 350. So this is about a 50% emissions reduction below our 1990 levels, which are 590. But the absolute minimum would be there. That's 25% below 1990, and that's basically what, in the international community is considered absolutely the minimal acceptable for developed countries. And we're way off. And by the way, we're not going to get there because there is no federal program in place that would ever hope to get us there. And I'll go to, this is Alberta. So I wanted to point out the presentation that Prime Minister Harper made to the United Nations just last week in Bonn. He proudly pointed out that Canada will meet the kinds of emissions reductions that in aggregate the provinces are promising, which is basically an admission that the federal government plans to do nothing. But I do want to point out that Quebec will meet its share of Canada's Kyoto target. Ontario is actually fairly close to meeting Kyoto. It's expecting to get 6% by 2014, so a little late, 15% by 2020, and 80% by 2050. British Columbia is targeting 33% reduction below 2007 levels, and on from there. Even Saskatchewan, which depends on coal for over 80% of its electricity, is expecting 80% emission reductions below 1990 levels by 2050. And then we get to Alberta. Again, this is from the horse's mouth. This is the Alberta government's climate change strategy report. And they say they're very proud of it and they want to be pace setters. So imagine if this was the pace set globally. There's no consequences for failure here either, by the way. Alberta is only committing to strive for the emission reductions, by the way, in yellow and orange. The green one, which is 73% of what they're promising or hoping for, is carbon capture and sequestration, and that depends on that technology being developed, which if you speak to people in the industry, in the carbon capture and sequestration industry, they're 20 years out before that's even possible, and yet Alberta is saying, oh yeah, already we're going to start to get, this year, emissions reductions from carbon capture and sequestration. If CCS works magically as quickly as Alberta projects, then, according to their very hopeful estimate, keep in mind that they're not showing you what happened here, which was this huge rise in emissions from down, sorry, sort of went like from there down that way. And they're expecting that now it's going to slow down. I don't know why. Sorry. So Alberta's emissions were about 170 megatons in 1990, 240 megatons in 2008, an increase of about 40%. And if CCS works much more quickly than the industry experts predict, then if this magic happens, they will still be almost 50% higher than 1990 levels by 2020. By 2050, when most scientists are calling for 80 to 100% emissions reductions, Alberta will still be emitting more than 10% more than it did way back in 1990. That's if everything goes according to plan. This is not an emissions reduction strategy. This is an emissions growth strategy. Alberta has per capita emissions more than 4 times higher than the rest of Canada. It's responsible for more than half of all Canada's emissions growth since 1990. And this year, Canada hid the tar sands numbers in the report. They were there, but because it's a big, big industry, in all previous reports, they've always highlighted what is the tar sands industry responsible for. In this report, it was ignored as just, one of a group of industries. In this last year, there was just another report. The tar sands industry now represents 6.5% of Canada's emissions, up from 5% just last year. 21% growth in a single year. The emissions intensity of the tar sands, which is another thing they've been touting about, how the tar sands, well, they're getting, cleaner. The emissions intensity per barrel of oil is getting better and better and better. We're using less, burning less to get every barrel of oil. Well, that was reversed this year. The emissions per barrel grew by 14.5% this last year. And none of this addresses the fact that what's really important about the tar sands is the end of pipe emissions, not the tar sands themselves. That's actually a small component of the overall emissions. The reason why we're so concerned about it is that we cannot burn everything on the planet, otherwise we will fry. So if we're going to choose to keep some of the oil in the ground, obviously we should be choosing to keep the dirtiest, most polluting oil in the ground. But the part of the emissions that's embodied in getting it out of the ground is still a small part of the total emissions. All of this stuff is then going to go on to get burned in cars, and there is no way of capturing that. No matter how hopeful you make this look, there is no way of capturing the 70 or more % of the emissions that are going to go out the tailpipe of a car. So, I'm also concerned about our loyal opposition. One of the few things that Harper was dragged kicking and screaming into was an agreement to phase out all fossil fuel subsidies. There are criticisms that he's been far too slow about this, and they're valid. Meanwhile, perhaps the most visible platform plank of the NDP in the past election was the focus on a brand new fossil fuel subsidy equivalent in value to all the other fossil fuel subsidies out there, which is a it's the promise to remove HST from home heating fuels. It's a gift to the fossil fuel industry. Why would you do that? It's the fourth election in a row that the NDP has campaigned on some sort of fossil fuel subsidy. And yesterday, Ontario's Environmental Commissioner, Gord Miller, slammed the provincial Liberal government for its 10% rebate on hydro, which he recognized as a perverse subsidy. And he took an additional swipe at both the NDP and the Tories in the province for proposing to remove HST from home heating. Also yesterday, I watched the Agenda's coverage of the Perimeter Institute's Equinox Summit to develop an energy strategy going forward to 2030. And virtually every panelist there agreed that to get the kind of reductions we need to see, we need to expect energy prices not just 10%, 15% higher, but several times higher than they are now. And that's actually something that is very, very correlated to emissions reductions. Every country that has had any success in reducing its emissions has much higher energy prices. If you look at Germany, if you look at Denmark, if you look at Norway, Sweden, all of those countries have very, very high energy prices. And it's not something that hurts the poor. Anybody who tells you that this hurts the poor is lying. The benefit of taking off HSD or reducing energy prices is overwhelmingly, it's a bigger benefit to rich people who have bigger homes and bigger heating bills. It is not going to benefit the low-income people living in a small apartment that's compact and hemmed in by neighbors. It's going to reduce the ability of the government to deliver the kinds of services that will get our low-income citizens to the point where they can actually get past their fossil fuel addiction. And ironically, it's actually raising fossil fuel prices that puts revenues in the hands of government that they can redistribute in such a way that it can actually benefit low-income citizens and give them the tools necessary to get past their addiction. So if I'm going to talk about, and there's all kinds of things that we have to do, but I really want to focus on this. The very first thing that we need to do, because none of the regulations matter, none of the, vehicle efficiency, investments in high-speed rail, none of that is going to matter if oil is so cheap that it's easier to get in your car. The absolutely number one thing we need to do is make sure, if you're serious about climate change, you have to demand and hold your governments to account and tell them that you find it offensive if they ever suggest dropping energy prices. And I just want to, sorry?
Isn't that putting more money into the energy companies' pockets?
Of course it is.
We're paying more for gasoline. Isn't Exxon profiting from that? So you're suggesting we should be giving Exxon more money by making the last payment?
No. I'm not suggesting that you line the pockets of fossil fuel companies. Quite the opposite. I want to point out two things. We're talking about taxes. People are willing to pay only so much for energy. What happens when energy prices rise, people will either move to smaller houses, they'll move closer to where they work, they'll get smaller cars, they'll commute, they'll carpool, or something like that. People make the choices to have their incomes match their expenditures. So people are only willing to pay so much for energy anyway. What the difference is that if you don't have taxes on it, then all of the money goes to the oil companies. If you do have taxes on it, then a huge proportion of that money goes to governments that can either redistribute them to the citizens to buy smarter things that aren't so energy intensive, like insulation, or retrofitting their homes, or getting smarter vehicles, or whatever it is.
Buy fighter jets.
Yeah, well, I'm against that.
Leave it in the hands of the people.
I wonder if I could suggest, I think we should... can I just interrupt a second? I think we should try and wind up if you can.
Yeah.
And then have some chance for some interchange.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Or governments can use them to use that money to invest in the infrastructure that they need. Either way, it's actually money that's taken away from the fossil fuel industries. So I'm going to close with just a reminder of how much time. And again, with that statement, 315,000 people are dying every year from climate change impacts. And I'll let you answer that question for yourselves.